In this part of how to use an article, we're going to cover the types and parts of scholarly articles. So there are two major types of scholarly articles. There's primary sources and there's secondary sources. A primary source is going to be a main source of information. It's going to be the original research that someone has conducted, whether it is a case study, so a handful of participants, whether it's an experiment, something that actually has a control group and an experimental group. And those are the kind of words that you're going to look for in the title to determine if something is a primary source. The other type of research article or scholarly article is going to be secondary. And this is going to be something that will take a whole bunch of those primary research articles and summarize them, find a common theme between them, and present the information. Sometimes this will be in the form of a literature review. Sometimes it's going to be a little more in-depth, so you're going to get a meta-analysis. And the very most in-depth and something that is actually almost like an experiment in and of itself would be a systematic review, which in a researcher will find every single article written on that topic and summarize the results. Let's look at an example of what we would find in the databases. So I searched for learning disabilities science. I limited to scholarly and peer-reviewed journals. And I see the first one on here is a meta-analysis. It will say it right there in the title of the article. You may also find that when you do a search like this, even if you limit it to scholarly or peer-reviewed sources or academic journals, you'll still end up with book reviews, you'll still end up with editorials. So do pay attention to what the title says it's going to be. Next, we're going to consider the various parts of a scholarly article. All scholarly articles should have pretty much the same parts. These are typically set out by the publication style guide, such as the APA style guide. The things you'll notice, starting from the top, is going to be the title. The title is intended to be a very clear explanation of what the article is. So, an exploratory study. It's going to tell you the major group that's being investigated, so learning disabled students with moderate intellectual disabilities. Typically, titles are supposed to be about 12 words long, and you'll also notice frequently an abbreviated title. So self-directed science up here. This is similar to the running head that you'll have in APA. Next up are going to be the authors with their affiliation. So I can see that these two are from this university, this author is from a second university. Frequently, you'll also have which department they're in. You'll find out what their credentials are, so whether they have PhDs, EDDs, so what their degrees are in. Next, you'll see an abstract. An abstract is always a section you want to read. First and foremost, it's going to give you the broad strokes of what's going on. This is the summary of the entire paper, typically between about 150 and 250 words long. The next section you'll typically see is an introduction. Often this will be combined with a literature review. So I can tell that this article is combined. The introduction and the literature review are combined. The introduction will tell you what we already know and what we want to know. And this does fold in with the literature review nicely because it's how we already know what we know. So in this one, I'm going to get a lot of citations because those are really common to see in the literature review part of an article. This is as good a background on a topic as you could hope to find, especially if you have a really, really narrow topic. So this will give you good background information, it'll give you good historical information. That's not the purpose of this article, though. The purpose of this article is to actually present new research. And that's where the methods section comes in. But at the end, you'll see the research questions. So this is where you find out why they are writing this paper, presenting this research, what they wanted to know beyond what they already knew from their literature review. The methods section is going to tell you how the experiment was conducted. One of the key points of the scientific method is that all research should be reproducible. You're also going to end up with the results section. This is when you're going to get all of their fun statistics, the numbers that they collected, the data that they collected. And then finally, you're going to have the discussion, which is kind of a summary of the results, but it will also include things like what this study didn't show, what our limitations were, here's what we did wrong. Those are all incredibly important things to include in a conclusions or discussion section. And this is also where you will frequently find this is what we need to research next, so areas for future study. The final section is the references page. This can be incredibly helpful for conducting additional research yourself. So what are we going to use this scholarly article for? Well, part of it is to help me focus on a narrow part of my topic. The other aspect is to look at the experiment or the interpretations of research in my field. Now, recognizing that there was an experiment conducted does not mean you actually have to read all of the steps taken in the experiment. For most of your papers, reading the experiment is going to kind of break the flow of what you're trying to get from the article. I'm going to use this to help me with scholarly interpretations. The literature review is really helpful for me to know what do experts in my field think about this topic. Same with the conclusions section. What else should I be looking into when it comes to my topic? And then finally, I'm going to use a scholarly article for these references. If I go out and I find this book or one of these articles somewhere else, I'm doing what's either called chaining or ancestry research. So I'm using their research to dive in a little bit deeper into their topics. As I read this introduction, I may decide that I'm really, really interested in this National Science Foundation framework. So I'm going to use this article to find that framework. Ideally, when I write my paper, I am not going to cite this. I'm going to actually go to that original source and cite the original source, as opposed to citing a secondary source like this. Now, what I'm not going to want to use this article for primarily, now I see students try and use scholarly articles for two things that aren't necessarily the best reasons to use a scholarly article. The first is raw data, basic statistics, especially demographic statistics. If I were to read in this article that 1 out of 68 children has autism, I don't know if that's the most up-to-date. I don't know if that's the most accurate. Ideally, I will use government sites to help me with raw data and statistics. And you can use the internet to find these. And if they are from these census.gov, cdc.gov, there's a National Center for Education Statistics webpage. If you are using these really high quality sources, you're going to get better data that's more up to date, and that you can even often drill down to your zip code level or your school district level. It's one of the things you can do to get Google to work for you a little bit better is in your Google search, if I were interested in autism statistics, I can add the phrase cite.gov and only come back with .government sites that are going to give me autism statistics. I could even limit it specifically to the CDC if I wanted to. And this way I am going to get the most up-to-date and also the most credible information on how many children in America have autism. And I can even get the prevalence rates historically. And again, good, detailed information. Another thing that students will often use is they'll try and use these articles for really broad overviews of an entire topic. Now, I love using scholarly articles to get in-depth detail about a very specific history of a topic. But if you're looking for something broader, say if I was looking for an understanding of what autism was, I wouldn't want to use a scholarly article for that. I would want to use a source more appropriate. So that may be a book, that may be an encyclopedia entry. For something like what is autism, it would probably be a CDC fact book that I would look for. So not everything that you need to find is going to come from a scholarly article. Let's go straight into how to read a scholarly article. I like using what I call the reverse Oreo method. Now, if you think about an Oreo cookie, everybody wants the innards first. You always open up the cookie, you eat the white creamy filling, and then if you're really desperate, you dunk the cookies in milk and eat the cookies. Well, reading a scholarly paper is the exact opposite. You want to start with the outside first and then work your way in. At an absolute bare minimum, you're going to read this as the outside part first. The next outside part is going to be the introduction and the literature review. Then finally, the conclusion, the discussion section and conclusion section, which for this starts right here, the discussion section. And quite frequently, the references. Now, I'm not saying read the references, I'm saying use the references. But you will want to read in any article that you're working with the abstract, the introduction and lit review, and the conclusion. If you are then analyzing or even trying to recreate this experiment, then you do want to go in and read the innards, the white creamy filling, so the methods section and the results section. When you get into higher level research, these are often very helpful. However, if you're creating more general information, if you're writing a basic paper as opposed to maybe a dissertation, it is acceptable to either skim over or even completely skip the methods and the results section so you can get to the information that you really need to write a really good paper. Otherwise, you do tend to get bogged down. The things you want to look for in these sections, you want to figure out what the claim is, what their thesis, what their hypothesis is, their affirmative statement. In this paper, that came at the end of the introduction. They wanted to know the primary research questions addressed. I want to know the scope of this. Who is this aiming to help? So if I say that using a KWHL chart is good for a student to complete a lesson independently, I need to keep in mind that I'm talking about students with moderate intellectual disabilities. Not all students, not students with severe intellectual disabilities. So I need to make sure that I'm not applying the information that they got from this to a group that they weren't actually researching. I do want to look at the method and say, is this a good sized group? Do the results make sense for what they've done? So if they're saying that this is valid, if they're saying this is significant, can I find a p-value and find out if that actually is significant, something like that. And often you can get that heavily in the discussion section. And then the last thing you want to do is fill in the gaps. What did they leave out? Because this is something that you can use to direct your own research. For this one, I have looked at self-directed science concepts with students with moderate intellectual disabilities. Can I apply that to a specific intellectual disability? Can I apply that to a student with autism? Can I apply that to a student who has a different learning disability, such as ADHD? So those are some of the gaps that I might consider looking for other articles on or even directing my own research. So when I find something in my article that is useful or interesting, I then want to use that article to summarize or paraphrase information for my paper. So for summarizing and paraphrasing, I'd like y'all to highlight this title in the PowerPoint, go to Academic Search Complete, and just paste that whole thing in. And find the article that I mention in here, the Psychophysiology of Mixed Emotional States. Click on the PDF, and I'd like you to try summarizing a section on page 800. So here's page 800, and try summarizing something within this section. This is something you'll often do, summarizing a large section from the introduction. When you have something put together, continue the video. What I came up with was by measuring the differences in circulation, breathing, and facial muscles, these authors were able to measure whether a test subject felt amusement or disgust when watching clips from movies. Yours can be something different, obviously. I find it's much easier to take a large chunk of text and then just really explain it quickly to someone sitting next to me or someone imaginary. I pick my husband pretty frequently. And just summarize it like that. You'll notice I took 2 huge chunks of writing and I distilled it to 1 sentence. Try this again with this next article, Humorlessness Elucidated. And page 403. So this is another section you'll frequently be summarizing, which is going to be the conclusion section. Try summarizing or paraphrasing this section. When you paraphrase, you are going to take something in a similar length and put it in your own words. And in this situation, I have my paraphrase. Very rarely you'll want to include a direct quote because the author has said something in a very good way. You'll notice at the end of that quote, I do have the page number cited. So that is how you are going to use these scholarly articles. You're going to paraphrase, summarize, and direct quote, typically from the introduction, the conclusions, and the literature review. And then you're going to use the bibliography largely to find other sources of material.